My wife laughed and said, "Teaching is for the poor. I don't date poor." But I'd been dreaming of quitting my corporate job for years. I wanted to go back to school and become a teacher, the kind that makes kids care about learning instead of just memorizing dates for tests. But I couldn't quit, not without my wife Carrie threatening to leave me. The night I told her about my dream, she laughed in my face and reminded me just how much me and her family need me. "You need a stable income," she reminded me. And by stable, she meant that I needed to continue paying off her parents' mortgage, pay for her brother's new car, pay for her sister's wedding, and fund her expensive luxury wardrobe and trips. But the job was exhausting. I worked 65 hours a week with a boss that liked to throw ceramic mugs at us whenever we made a mistake. I only stayed to keep my wife happy. I came home early from a work conference one day and bought flowers to surprise my wife. But when I got home, I heard her voice coming from our room. He wanted to quit and become a teacher. Can you imagine? He's not attractive, he's boring and awful in bed, and now he wants to lose his high-paying salary over a teaching job? It's literally the only thing I like about him, she mocked, laughing loudly. Yup, just 2 more years and I can finally divorce him. My lawyer said 7 years is perfect for the payout. My family will be taken care of, I take half of everything, and then we can finally be together. She giggled. I froze at her words, trying to process everything, from mocking my dream to the planned marriage and divorce to her actually cheating on me. For 5 years, I was led to believe the beautiful woman I met at the cafe loved me the way I loved her. But I was wrong. I walked back outside before she could see me and sat in my car for 20 minutes staring at one of those teaching brochures. Then I made my decision. The next 3 weeks were the calmest I'd been in years, because I finally had a plan. I met with a lawyer, and we started documenting every single payment to her family for the past 5 years. Every bank transfer, every text message of her asking for money, every receipt. I started dumping money into my old premarital savings account she didn't know existed and redirected all my paychecks there. Then I collected evidence from her iPad, screenshots of her with her affair partner discussing the things they'd do after she left me, the things she'd do with her half of the money. Then I did something that felt absolutely insane. I applied to teaching credential programs. I figured if my wife wasn't going to be around to drain me of cash, I could finally go for my dream job as a teacher. When I got an offer to enroll in an accelerated teaching program across the country with a guaranteed job after, I accepted it immediately and started to hunt for an apartment. Meanwhile, my wife Carrie used the remaining money in the bank to fund her girls' weekend trip, which was obviously an excuse to see the other guy, while her family took out a huge loan for a luxury shopping spree, thinking I'd still be around to pay it back when time came. I just smiled, of course. Whatever they needed, Carrie always encouraged them to go for it, swipe away at their credit card and leave it to me. But that weekend, she left for her trip. I left too, moving across the country to start the program. I instantly loved it. A portion of the program had hands-on experience with classrooms. The best part was meeting Anne, the school counselor. When I mentioned how I'd transitioned from corporate to teaching, instead of laughing at me like my wife, Anne's face lit up. "That's amazing. I left corporate HR 2 years ago to do this work, took a $30,000 pay cut, moved into a tiny apartment, started eating pasta 4 nights a week. Best decision I ever made." We talked some more after classes, chatting about working with kids and finding actual purpose in work instead of just chasing salaries. "I'm technically broke compared to before, but somehow I'm a lot happier," she grinned. That's when it clicked for me. This was what I wanted. So I made the final move. I had my lawyer serve Carrie the divorce papers the moment she arrived from her trip. She called me immediately, sounding furious. "You're divorcing me? Where is this even coming from? Is this about the teaching thing?" "Okay, I know I went too far with the joke, but we can talk about it." I sighed and sent her screenshots of her conversation with her affair partner, how she mentioned the 7-year plan. She stammered, "That was for something different. Baby, please, don't do this. We need you." I frowned. "That's the problem. You need me, but you don't love me," I said, heartbroken that it took this long for me to realize. But that's when things started getting messy for her. All the loans and outstanding payments suddenly caught up to them. Her parents panicked about losing their house when the mortgage payment didn't show up. They called her crying and then angry. "How could you be so stupid? He was helping us. Fix this!" So she did, when she showed up to my classroom out of the blue, holding a receipt. I looked up, and there she was, standing in the doorway with a piece of paper held high like some kind of proof. 25 eighth graders went silent instantly, their heads swiveling between me and this woman they'd never seen before. Her voice cut through the quiet. She said she returned it, that she was changing, that I needed to see this receipt. My hand froze on the whiteboard marker as she took a step into the room, her heels clicking on the floor. One of my students whispered something to another, and I felt my professional space crumbling around me. I opened my mouth to respond, but footsteps echoed in the hallway, and Principal Rena appeared, her expression calm but firm. She placed herself between Carrie and my students, telling her she needed to leave campus immediately. Carrie started to argue, but Rena cut her off, explaining this was a school policy violation and she wasn't welcome here. I stood there watching as Rena guided Carrie toward the door, my carefully built teaching life suddenly feeling contaminated by everything I'd tried to escape. The students stared at me as the door closed, and I turned back to the whiteboard, my hands shaking as I tried to continue the lesson, like nothing had happened. The final bell rang, and I grabbed my bag, desperate to get to my car before anything else could go wrong. I made it halfway across the parking lot when Carrie stepped out from between two vehicles, waving that receipt at me. She said it proved she returned the diamond bracelet, the one she bought with our money last month. Her words came fast, insisting she understood now, that she was changing, that we just needed to talk without lawyers getting in the way. I kept walking toward my car, my keys already in my hand. She followed, still talking, saying we could work this out if I'd just listen. I unlocked my door and turned to face her, keeping my voice steady as I told her any communication needed to go through Lucas. She started to respond, but I was already sliding into the driver's seat, pulling the door shut while she was mid-sentence. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I backed out, watching her standing there in my rearview mirror. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, forwarding Principal Rena's incident report to Lucas, along with a photo I'd taken of Carrie's receipt. I typed out a factual summary of what happened, sticking to times and actions without adding emotional commentary. His response came back within an hour, saying this strengthened our harassment case and reminding me to document everything without engaging directly. I read his email 3 times, feeling my panic start to shift into something more manageable. It wasn't calm exactly, but it was a checklist of actions I could actually control. I created a new folder on my computer labeled Documentation and started organizing every interaction, every email, every incident. The structure helped my brain stop spinning in circles. The next morning, my phone rang during my planning period, and Gabrielle Kim's name appeared on the screen. She asked me to come to the program office when I had a moment. I walked over between classes, my stomach tight with worry that I'd somehow violated program rules. She gestured for me to sit and asked directly if I needed any help with my legal situation. Her tone was kind, but professional, as she explained the school took student safety seriously, and they'd support me in keeping my personal and professional life separate. She asked if I needed any schedule adjustments or security measures. I left her office 15 minutes later feeling less like a problem case and more like a professional they were invested in protecting. The validation settled something in my chest that had been twisted tight since yesterday. My afternoon lesson fell apart spectacularly. A group of 8th graders tested every single boundary I set, talking over me, refusing to follow directions, deliberately disrupting the activity I'd planned. I lost control of the classroom for a solid 15 minutes, my voice getting sharper as I tried to regain authority. Finally, I stopped everything, reset the expectations with clear consequences, and started over. The rest of the period limped along, but the damage was done. Walking to my car afterward, I was mad at myself for letting Carrie's chaos bleed into the one thing I actually wanted to protect. These kids deserved better than a teacher who couldn't focus because his ex-wife was stalking him at work. I stopped by Anne's office during her posted hours, needing to talk to someone who understood the teaching world. She looked up from her paperwork, and I mentioned briefly that my divorce situation got messy this week. She listened without asking for details I didn't offer, validating that career transitions were hard enough without personal problems exploding at the same time. Then she smoothly redirected to discussing classroom management strategies that actually worked, sharing specific techniques she'd seen other new teachers use successfully. I appreciated that she kept things centered on work. It was the only part of my life that felt like it was moving forward instead of collapsing backward. At 11 p.m., my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I made the mistake of answering and heard Carrie's mother's voice. She started by begging me to reconsider the divorce, saying families work through hard times together. Then her tone shifted, and she scolded me for abandoning them when they'd always treated me like a son. I listened for maybe 3 minutes, feeling the old guilt rise up in my chest, like it always did when her family made demands. But this time I quietly ended the call and blocked the number, choosing self-protection over people-pleasing. The guilt didn't disappear, but I did it anyway. Lucas sent an email Saturday morning requesting complete financial records for the past 5 years. He warned me that moving money into my old premarital account was legal, but needed to be fully documented to avoid accusations of hiding assets. I spent my entire Saturday organizing bank statements, transfer records, and screenshots of Carrie's texts asking for money. I built spreadsheets tracking every payment to her parents' mortgage, her brother's car, her sister's wedding, her shopping trips. The sheer volume of evidence was both validating and depressing. 5 years of funding other people's lives, all laid out in rows and columns. Monday morning, Lucas called to walk me through what to expect in court. He explained that most payments to Carrie's family would probably be treated as gifts, since I wasn't legally required to support them. That meant I wouldn't recover that money. Something heavy settled in my chest as he talked. Not surprise exactly, but grief over the sunk cost of 5 years. He told me to focus on protecting future earnings, not getting revenge for past losses. I understood the logic, but it still hurt to accept I'd never see that money again. That evening, I opened Facebook and saw Carrie had posted something vague about people who abandon their promises when things get hard. I stared at it for a long moment, drafting 3 different responses in my head. Then I closed the app and reminded myself that engaging was exactly what she wanted. The restraint felt like a small victory, even though my hands were clenched into fists. Thursday morning, my mentor sat in the back of my classroom with her observation clipboard while I tried to teach a lesson about the Industrial Revolution. I'd planned the whole thing out the night before, but my brain kept jumping to Carrie's mother's voice on the phone and the blocked number sitting in my call history. I asked the class a question about factory conditions and called on a girl in the front row who looked confused. She gave a vague answer about machines, and I nodded and moved forward to the next point without checking if anyone actually understood. 3 more students raised their hands with questions, but I was already writing dates on the board and didn't notice. When I turned around, half the class had stopped taking notes and were just staring at me or whispering to each other. I pushed through the rest of the material anyway, covering everything I'd planned, but missing every sign that I'd lost them completely. After the bell rang, my mentor asked me to stay, and we sat at my desk for the debrief. She opened her notes and was specific about what went wrong. I wasn't checking for understanding before moving to new concepts. My pacing was too fast, and I didn't adjust when students showed confusion. I missed obvious signs that the room had checked out halfway through. She told me I needed to read the room better and actually pause to make sure learning was happening instead of just delivering content. I felt deflated sitting there listening to her list everything I'd done wrong. But I also felt grateful because she was giving me feedback I could actually use instead of just saying I did fine or being vague about improvement. She didn't ask what was distracting me, and I didn't volunteer the information. We just focused on the teaching and what needed to change. Friday morning, I stood in front of the same class and owned the rough lesson from the day before. I told them I'd moved too fast and hadn't checked if they were actually understanding the material before pushing forward. A few kids looked surprised that I was admitting a mistake, but I kept going. I asked them to help me design a review activity that would actually work for how they learned. We ended up breaking into small groups where they had to teach each other different aspects of the Industrial Revolution using whatever method made sense to them. Some groups made timelines, others did role plays. One group created a comparison chart. The kids who'd completely checked out on Thursday were suddenly engaged and asking questions and actually learning. After class, one of the 8th graders who usually sat in the back doing nothing stopped by my desk. He told me he respected teachers who admit when they mess up instead of pretending everything's perfect. I realized that being accountable might build credibility faster than faking confidence ever could. Monday afternoon, I got an email from Lucas with an attachment labeled Settlement Proposal. Carrie's lawyer had sent over terms. She would drop her request for spousal support completely if I agreed to take over her parents' mortgage payments and her brother's car loan. The email laid it all out in formal legal language, but the message was clear. She wanted me to keep funding her family just under a different structure. I read through it twice, feeling that familiar pull of guilt and obligation. Maybe I could just take on the mortgage and be done with the whole court process. Maybe avoiding a trial would be worth it. I forwarded the email to Lucas and called him 20 minutes later. He answered on the second ring, and I could hear him typing in the background. I asked him what he thought about the proposal. He called it creative fiction and said Carrie's lawyer was trying to repackage the same financial dependence under new terms. He told me to decline and let the court process continue. The mortgage and car loan weren't my legal responsibility, and taking them on would just trap me in the same cycle I'd escaped. I was tempted by the idea of avoiding trial and just ending this whole thing. But I trusted Lucas's expertise more than I trusted any promise from Carrie. I told him to decline the proposal, and we'd see what happened next. 3 days later, Lucas called with news that the preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. That meant I needed to request time off from my practicum and figure out how to get back across the country on a budget that was already stretched tight. I pulled up my calendar and stared at the empty boxes representing the next few weeks. I had teaching obligations every weekday, assignments due for the credential program, the court date. I needed to add therapy appointments somewhere in there too. I started blocking out time in different colors: blue for teaching, red for court stuff, green for assignments, yellow for therapy. The visual structure helped my brain stop spinning in circles trying to hold everything at once. I could see exactly what needed to happen and when. I sent an email to Gabrielle requesting 2 days off for a legal matter and asking about making up the practicum hours. She responded within an hour, saying the program had procedures for this, and we'd work it out. I booked the cheapest flight I could find and reserved a budget hotel near the courthouse, The whole trip would cost me almost $400 I didn't really have, but there was no way around it. The preliminary hearing happened on a Tuesday morning in a courthouse that smelled like floor polish and old paper. Lucas met me outside, and we went through security together. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lights that made everything look tired. Carrie sat on the other side with her lawyer looking put together in a navy dress. The judge came in and everyone stood. He was an older man with reading glasses who looked like he'd heard 1,000 divorce cases just like this one. Both lawyers presented their sides. Carrie's lawyer talked about her need for support while going through this difficult transition. Lucas talked about the affair and the 7-year plan and my documentation of financial manipulation. The judge listened without much expression and took notes. Then he made his ruling. Temporary spousal support of $800 per month while the case proceeded, plus a freeze on any major asset transfers pending full discovery. I felt anger rise up hot in my chest. I had to pay Carrie $800 every month after everything she'd done. After the affair and the lies and the plan to divorce me for money. Lucas must have seen my face because he leaned over and quietly reminded me this was standard and temporary. The judge wasn't making a final decision about anything. This was just to maintain status quo until the full case got resolved. I nodded, but I still felt like I'd been punched. We left the courthouse, and I stood on the steps for a minute trying to steady myself. Lucas told me this was actually a good outcome because it could have been worse. I was still standing, even if I felt like I'd lost. Back at the school the next day, I ran into Anne in the hallway between classes. She asked how I was doing, and I mentioned I'd had a court thing and it went okay. I kept the details minimal because I didn't want to dump my whole mess on her. She nodded and suggested I look into the campus counseling services. The program offered free sessions for students dealing with major life stress. I felt resistant to the idea immediately. Therapy seemed like something for people who couldn't handle their problems, but I was also exhausted enough that maybe I needed help. Anne didn't push. She just said the resource was there if I wanted it, and then we talked about an upcoming staff meeting. I appreciated that she didn't pry or try to fix anything. She just offered information and let me decide. 2 days later, Lucas emailed me a copy of a motion Carrie had filed. She was claiming I abandoned the marriage and dissipated marital assets by moving across the country without warning. The legal language made it sound like I'd just disappeared one day and stolen money. Lucas was already preparing a response that would detail her affair, the 7-year plan, and all my documented evidence of her financial manipulation. He attached a draft for me to review. I sat at my kitchen table reading through the legal description of my marriage. It felt like looking at someone else's life written in formal paragraphs and numbered points. The woman who'd planned to divorce me for money. The husband who'd documented everything and left. It was all true, but seeing it spelled out in court filings made it feel distant and strange. I sent Lucas a few small corrections and told him the rest looked accurate. Then I closed my laptop and sat in the quiet of my apartment, feeling hollowed out. The next morning, a parent stopped by the front office and asked to speak with principal. The office staff came to get her, and I found out later what happened. The parent had heard something about my personal life and wanted to make sure it wouldn't affect her daughter's education. She was polite, but concerned. Principal handled it professionally. She reassured the parent that all staff maintain appropriate boundaries and that personal matters don't interfere with student learning. Then she came to find me during my planning period and told me we needed a clear communication plan if anyone else asked. I felt my face get hot with embarrassment. My divorce was becoming school gossip. Parents were asking questions, but principal wasn't punishing me or making it worse. She was just being practical about managing the situation. We agreed on a simple script. If anyone asked, I would say I was going through a divorce, and it was handled appropriately outside of school. Keep it brief and professional. Don't volunteer details. I thanked her and left her office feeling mortified, but also grateful she wasn't making this harder than it already was. That afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered and heard a customer service voice asking for me by name. It was a credit card company calling about a past due balance on an account where I was listed as an authorized user. I felt panic spike in my chest. I told them I'd never used that card. They said my name was on the account as an authorized user for one of Carrie's family members. I asked them to send me documentation of what I'd supposedly signed. They said they'd email the records. I hung up and immediately started pulling together my own documentation showing I'd never signed anything for that account. I added it to my growing file of financial cleanup tasks. Each folder was getting thicker. Bank statements, transfer records, credit disputes, legal filings. The panic that hit was sharp, but I forced myself to channel it into careful record keeping. Every document labeled and dated, every dispute filed properly. I couldn't control what Carrie's family tried to pin on me, but I could control my response. My first counseling session happened on a Thursday afternoon in a small office in the campus health center. The counselor was a woman in her 40s who didn't waste time with small talk. She asked me what brought me in, and I gave her the short version. Marriage ending. Wife had been using me financially. I'd left and started the teaching program, now dealing with divorce proceedings and trying to stay focused on the school. She listened and took a few notes. Then she started asking questions about patterns. How did I usually show love in relationships? What did I think made me valuable to other people? How did I feel when someone asked me for money? I answered honestly and heard myself describing a pattern I'd never named out loud before. I equated providing financially with being loved. If I could pay for things and solve problems and take care of people, then I was worthy of love. Carrie had seen that pattern and used it. She turned my desire to be needed into a way to fund her whole family. The counselor didn't tell me what to feel or how to fix it. She just helped me name what was already there. We talked about how I could separate my worth from my wallet, how being generous was different from being used, how I could learn to recognize when someone wanted me versus when they just wanted my money. I left the session feeling tired but somehow lighter, like I'd set down something heavy I'd been carrying for years. 2 days later, I opened an email from my old apartment complex, and my stomach dropped when I saw the early termination fee. 2 months' rent as a penalty, nearly $3,000 I hadn't fully calculated when I left. I sat at my desk, staring at the number, feeling anger spike hot in my chest before it cooled into something more like tired acceptance. I pulled up my budget spreadsheet and started moving numbers around, cutting my grocery budget even tighter and canceling the streaming service I barely used anyway. The math worked, but just barely, leaving me with almost nothing for emergencies. I transferred the money that afternoon and watched my savings account shrink, reminding myself that freedom has a price, and this one was worth paying, even when it hurt. The next week, I was teaching a lesson on fractions, when movement in the parking lot caught my eye through the classroom window. Carrie stood next to a silver sedan, not walking toward the building but clearly visible, her arms crossed as she stared at the school entrance. My heart started pounding hard enough that I lost my place in the lesson for a solid 10 seconds. I recovered and kept teaching but pulled out my phone during the next activity and texted the front office that my estranged wife was in the parking lot and I needed help. Within 5 minutes, Principal Rena appeared with a security officer, both of them walking purposefully toward the lot. I watched from inside as they approached Carrie, had a brief conversation, and gestured toward the street. She argued for a minute, pointing at the building, but eventually got in her car and drove away. The security officer took photos of her license plate and the timestamp on his phone. My hands shook as I tried to refocus on helping students with their work, grateful I'd followed protocol instead of confronting her myself. That afternoon, I filed formal paperwork with the school district requesting a workplace no-contact order, filling out forms that documented every interaction Carrie had attempted since the divorce started. The district HR person reviewed my documentation, asked clarifying questions about dates and locations, then assured me the request would be processed within 3 business days. 2 days later, Carrie sent an email with the subject line, "I'm sorry for any confusion," where she apologized for any misunderstanding about appropriate boundaries, without actually admitting she'd done anything wrong. The language was so carefully worded, it was obviously written by a lawyer, designed to sound apologetic without creating legal liability. I forwarded it to Lucas with a one-line message asking if this changed anything, and he responded that it was classic manipulation dressed up as contrition, and I should not reply under any circumstances. 3 weeks later, Lucas called to tell me the court had scheduled mandatory mediation with a neutral mediator named Brianna Cross, who would try to help us reach a settlement before trial. He explained this was standard procedure in divorce cases and could actually be productive if both sides negotiated in good faith, though he was skeptical given Carrie's pattern of bad faith tactics throughout the process. I asked if mediation meant I had to sit in a room with her, and he said yes, but he'd be there, and the mediator would control the conversation. I felt cautiously hopeful that maybe we could contain this mess without a full trial that would drain my savings and drag on for months. Lucas warned me not to get my hopes up too high, but agreed it was worth trying. The mediation happened on a Thursday morning in a conference room at the courthouse. Carrie arrived with her lawyer, a sharp-looking woman in an expensive suit, who immediately took control of their side of the table. Brianna Cross introduced herself as a retired family court judge, who now worked as a mediator, explaining the ground rules about respectful communication and good faith negotiation. Then Carrie's lawyer launched into their opening proposal. She would waive all claims to spousal support, which could save me tens of thousands over time, if I agreed to assume responsibility for her family's debts, including the mortgage, the car loans, and the credit cards. The total liability would be over $80,000. I said no immediately, explaining I never co-signed any of those obligations and wasn't legally responsible for them. Lucas backed me up with documentation showing my name appeared nowhere on the loan paperwork, that all the debts belonged solely to Carrie's family members. Brianna took detailed notes and suggested we take a 15-minute break to let both sides consider their positions. During the break, Lucas pulled me into a small side office and showed me something he'd uncovered during discovery. Carrie had used my login credentials to set up recurring automatic payments to her parents' mortgage company, making it look like I'd formally committed to covering the payments, even though I'd never signed the actual loan documents. He had screenshots of the payment setup page showing my username, but an IP address that traced back to Carrie's location, not mine. He said this could potentially be pursued as unauthorized use of my financial accounts if we needed that leverage, though it would complicate the case. I felt violated all over again, seeing how she'd manipulated the system to trap me, but I also felt grimly satisfied that her schemes were unraveling under scrutiny. Every piece of evidence Lucas uncovered made her position weaker and mine stronger. When we reconvened, Carrie started talking directly to me instead of going through the lawyers, her voice rising as she accused me of selfishness and abandoning my responsibilities. She called it a midlife crisis, said I was running away from real life to play teacher, claimed I was punishing her whole family for one mistake. Her lawyer tried to rein her in, but Carrie kept going, getting more emotional and less coherent. I stayed completely silent, letting her vent while I focused on keeping my face neutral and my body language calm. Brianna noticed the dynamic and started directing questions specifically to me, asking what terms I could actually live with and what my priorities were for settlement. I answered factually, focusing on the financial documentation and my lack of legal obligation to Carrie's family. I realized that not reacting to emotional bait was its own form of power, that staying calm while she spiraled made me look reasonable and her look unstable. But mediation stalled completely when neither side would budge on the core issue. Carrie insisted I owed her family financial support because I'd been making payments for 5 years, creating an implied obligation. I insisted that gifts made during the marriage didn't create legal liability after divorce. Brianna tried several compromise proposals, but we couldn't find middle ground. Finally, she closed her notebook and scheduled a follow-up mediation session in 2 weeks, suggesting both sides use that time to seriously consider whether trial was really in anyone's best interest. Lucas walked me to my car afterward and warned me we were probably heading to trial, which meant more legal fees, more time, and more stress. I felt disappointed, but not devastated, because I'd already survived the worst of this, and I knew I could survive a trial too. Back at the school the following week, I decided to pilot a project-based lesson where students researched local history and presented their findings to the class. I'd been planning it for a while, but kept putting it off because it required more setup than regular lectures. I divided the class into small groups, gave them research questions about the town's founding and development, and turned them loose with laptops and library books. For the first 20 minutes, I worried it was going to be chaos, but then something clicked. Kids who normally zoned out started asking questions about old photographs they found online. Groups that usually argued over everything collaborated on presentation slides. I watched them actually learning instead of just memorizing facts for a test, making connections between historical events and their own lives. For 3 solid hours, I forgot about the divorce entirely, lost in the satisfaction of watching education actually work the way it was supposed to. After the final bell, Anne stopped by my classroom and told me she'd walked past during the presentations and they looked great from the hallway. We ended up talking for 20 minutes about teaching philosophy, about what actually makes kids care about learning versus just going through the motions. She told me about a project she'd done with students last year where they interviewed family members about local history, and it had been one of her best teaching experiences. I shared my frustration with standardized testing and how it pushed teachers toward memorization instead of real understanding. Before she left, we had an explicit conversation about timing, both of us acknowledging there was potential for something more, but agreeing we should keep things professional until my divorce was finalized. I appreciated her directness and her patience, the way she respected boundaries without making it awkward. Walking to my car that evening, I felt something unfamiliar, something that might have been contentment. That night, I sat in my apartment scrolling through my phone while eating leftover pasta, and Carrie's affair partner's Instagram popped up in my feed because we still had mutual connections. He'd posted vacation photos from some beach resort, cocktails, and sunset shots, all taken within the last few days. I checked the dates and realized Carrie wasn't in any of them. No tagged photos, no comments from her, nothing suggesting she was there or even in contact with him. I stared at the images waiting for some reaction to hit me, some surge of anger or satisfaction or vindication, but I just felt blank. The relationship I'd spent months mourning felt so completely dead that even the confirmation of her affair partner moving on without her registered as old news, something that happened to different people in a different life. I closed the app and noticed I hadn't actually checked her social media or his in over a week, maybe longer. The compulsive need to know what she was doing had faded without me noticing. The bank called me 2 days later while I was grading papers between classes, The representative confirmed that I wasn't legally liable for the disputed credit card, since I'd never signed the original account agreement or authorization forms. I felt relief wash over me as she explained they'd remove the associated charges from my records within 30 days. But then she mentioned almost casually that my credit score had dropped 15 points due to the account activity showing up temporarily on my report before the dispute was resolved. I pulled up my credit monitoring app right there in the hallway and saw the dip, a small red arrow pointing down next to a number that was still decent, but lower than it should be. The win felt hollow, tainted by the annoying side effect that would take months to fully correct. I thanked the representative and ended the call, then immediately signed up for a credit monitoring service that cost $12 a month I didn't really want to spend. Legal victories apparently came with their own set of problems. During a challenging class discussion about civil rights the following week, my 8th graders got into a heated debate about fairness and justice. One student argued that the system was rigged against regular people, that powerful people could get away with anything while everyone else suffered. Another student pushed back, saying that laws existed to protect everyone equally. I felt the urge rising in my chest to jump in with my own situation as an example, to vent about how Carrie had manipulated me for 5 years and was still trying to drain me financially through the legal system. The words were right there, ready to spill out, a perfect real-world illustration of systemic unfairness. But I caught myself mid-breath and redirected instead, bringing up historical examples of civil rights violations and legal reforms, keeping the discussion focused on the curriculum rather than my personal drama. After class, I stood at my desk organizing papers and recognized something important. I was getting better at emotional containment, at processing my own stuff in therapy instead of dumping it on teenagers who needed me to be their teacher, not their friend seeking validation. The boundary felt healthy even though maintaining it required constant effort. Insomnia hit me hard that week. 3 nights straight of lying in bed staring at my ceiling while my brain replayed every conversation with Lucas, every financial calculation, every moment of the divorce process. I tried everything I could think of on my tight budget. The first night I just suffered through it. The second night I downloaded a meditation app that wanted $15 for premium features I couldn't afford. By the third night, I was exhausted enough to actually problem solve instead of just enduring. I built a simple routine using resources I actually had. No phone after 9 p.m., cheap drugstore earplugs that cost $3, 10 minutes of journaling before bed to dump all the anxious thoughts onto paper instead of letting them circle in my head. It wasn't perfect, and I still woke up once or twice, but I actually slept for solid stretches instead of watching the hours tick by. I felt competent for solving a problem with what I had, instead of waiting for ideal conditions or expensive solutions. Small wins were starting to add up in ways that felt more sustainable than dramatic victories. Carrie's deposition happened on a Tuesday morning, and Lucas spent 2 hours the day before preparing me for the aggressive questioning her lawyer would use. He ran through potential questions, coached me on staying factual, reminded me over and over not to speculate about Carrie's motivations or get drawn into emotional arguments. The actual deposition took place in a conference room at her lawyer's office, fluorescent lights humming overhead while a court reporter typed every word. Carrie's lawyer was smooth and practiced, asking questions designed to make me look vindictive or cruel. He implied I'd abandoned my wife without warning, that I'd hidden assets maliciously, that my sudden career change was really about punishing her for not supporting my dreams. I stuck to dates, documents, and facts exactly like Lucas had coached me. When her lawyer asked if I was being vindictive by refusing to help with her family's debts, I simply referenced the iPad messages showing her 7-year plan to divorce me and take half of everything. I watched him pause, flip through his notes, and move on to a different line of questioning. Lucas caught my eye across the table and gave the smallest nod of approval. Lucas introduced the iPad evidence during the next discovery session, and I wasn't there to see it happen, but he called me afterward sounding more satisfied than I'd ever heard him. He described how he'd presented the screenshots of Carrie discussing with her affair partner what she'd do with her half of the money after the divorce, how she'd laughed about the 7-year plan being perfect timing, how she'd complained about me wanting to become a teacher. Watching her lawyer's face when he saw the messages had been grimly satisfying, Lucas told me, because Carrie's whole narrative about my sudden abandonment and her shock at the divorce collapsed under her own words. She'd been planning this for years, while I was working myself into exhaustion to fund her family's lifestyle. Her lawyer had tried to argue the messages were taken out of context, but the timestamps and conversation threads made the intent crystal clear. I didn't gloat when Lucas finished explaining everything, but I did feel validated in a way I hadn't expected to need. The truth was documented and undeniable now, not just my word against hers. The judge ordered a detailed accounting of all payments I'd made to Carrie's family over the past 5 years, and Lucas warned me again that recovery was unlikely, but the context would help establish the pattern of financial manipulation. I spent the entire weekend building spreadsheets, pulling bank statements, organizing receipts, categorizing every payment by type and recipient. Mortgage payments to her parents, car loan payments for her brother, wedding expenses for her sister, shopping trips and vacations for Carrie herself. The numbers climbed higher with each entry until the total hit $60,000, money I'd earned through 65-hour work weeks, and a boss who threw ceramic mugs at us. I stared at that number for a long time, feeling physically sick, my stomach churning at the sheer waste of it all. But underneath the nausea was something else, something that felt weirdly like freedom. I was done funding other people's lives, done being the ATM they could access whenever they wanted something they couldn't afford themselves. That $60,000 was gone, and I'd never get it back, but at least the drain had finally stopped. My guaranteed job offer letter arrived in the mail on a Thursday, a thick envelope from the school district that made my hands shake as I opened it. The letter outlined the position, the salary that was less than half what I'd made in corporate but enough to live on, the benefits package that included health insurance and a small retirement contribution. Everything was contingent on completing the credential program and passing the final evaluations, but the offer was real and specific, and mine. I read through it 3 times looking for catches or conditions I'd missed, then taped the letter to my bathroom mirror right next to my daily schedule. Every morning when I brushed my teeth, I could see that reminder that stability was visible, even if it was still a few months away. The job wasn't glamorous or high-paying, but it was purpose-driven work that mattered, and I'd earned it through my own effort instead of inheriting it or manipulating someone into providing it. I met with a financial counselor through the teaching program the following week, a woman named Maria, who specialized in helping career changers build realistic budgets. She pulled up a spreadsheet on her laptop, and we went through my income and expenses line by line. Temporary spousal support going out, student loan payments, rent, utilities, groceries, gas, the credit monitoring service, therapy copays. She showed me where I could cut costs without sacrificing necessities, suggested a cheaper cell phone plan, recommended a grocery store with better prices. Then she helped me build a plan for a small emergency fund, just $25 a week automatically transferred to savings, money I wouldn't even notice missing, but that would add up to over $1,000 in a year. I left her office with a printed budget that was tight but workable, every dollar accounted for, no wishful thinking or vague hopes. The plan felt empowering because it was based on actual numbers instead of the vague anxiety that had been churning in my gut for months. A student had a breakdown during class the next day, a quiet kid named Nathan who normally sat in the back and did his work without causing problems. We were halfway through a lesson on westward expansion when he suddenly put his head down on his desk and started crying, not loud, dramatic sobs, but quiet shaking that I could see from across the room. I paused the lesson and walked over to his desk, crouched down next to him, and asked quietly if he needed to step outside. He nodded, and I walked him into the hallway, letting the class continue their reading assignment, while I listened to him explain that his family was getting evicted and he didn't know where they were going to live. I didn't try to fix everything or offer solutions I couldn't deliver, just listened and acknowledged how scary that must be, then walked him down to Anne's office so he could talk to someone with actual resources to help. When I got back to my classroom, I noticed Principal Rena standing in the hallway near my door, and she caught my eye and nodded before walking away. After school, she stopped by my room and told me I'd handled the situation exactly right, that de-escalating and connecting students to appropriate support was exactly what good teachers did. I realized my own crisis had given me empathy and tools I didn't have before, that struggling had taught me how to recognize and respond to other people's struggles without making it about me. 2 weeks later, Rena called me into her office and handed me a printed evaluation form with handwritten notes in the margins. I sat in the chair across from her desk and read through her assessment line by line. She'd noted my growth in classroom management, specifically how I'd improved at reading student engagement and adjusting lessons in real time. She mentioned my ability to build rapport with struggling students, citing the Nathan situation as an example of appropriate crisis response. In the section on professional conduct, she wrote that I'd handled significant personal stress while maintaining boundaries and focusing on student needs. The final recommendation said I showed promise as an educator, and she would recommend me for hire when I completed the program. I read it 3 times sitting there in her office, letting myself feel proud of something I'd actually earned through work instead of salary. Rena told me to keep a copy for my portfolio and reminded me that teaching was hard work, but I was doing it right. I walked back to my classroom holding that evaluation like it was proof I wasn't wasting my time on this career change. That night, I opened my laptop to find an email from Carrie with the subject line, "Look what you did." The message contained a single photo of a mortgage delinquency notice addressed to her parents, stamped with red letters warning about foreclosure proceedings. Her message below the photo said, "This is what you've done to my family. They're losing their home because you abandoned your responsibilities. I hope you're happy with yourself." I stared at the screen for maybe 30 seconds, feeling that old guilt try to surface, then forwarded the entire email to Lucas without typing a response. I added a note suggesting we propose a final settlement offer because I was done with the emotional warfare and wanted this finished. He replied within an hour, agreeing it was time to close this out, that we had enough evidence and Carrie's desperation was showing. He asked me to think about realistic terms I could live with, and we'd schedule a call to draft the proposal. Over the weekend, Lucas and I worked out pragmatic settlement terms on a long phone call, where I sat at my kitchen table with a calculator and my budget spreadsheet. I proposed a modest lump sum of $5,000 from selling our remaining joint possessions like furniture and kitchen stuff, 6 months of limited spousal support at $500 monthly, which would give Carrie time to figure out her situation, absolutely no liability for any family debts since I never signed for them, and a mutual no-contact agreement, especially regarding my workplace. Lucas thought the terms were reasonable and asked if I was sure about the spousal support, since we had evidence of her affair. I told him I just wanted it done, and 6 months of small payments was worth avoiding a trial. He said he'd present it as my final offer before we proceeded to court, and warned me that Carrie would probably push back. I felt firm but fair about the proposal, not generous, but not vindictive either, just ready to move on with clear boundaries. A few days later, I was scrolling through social media during lunch and saw that Carrie's affair partner had posted something vague about moving on from toxic situations and choosing peace. I clicked through to Carrie's profile out of curiosity and noticed she hadn't posted anything in over a week, which was unusual for someone who normally shared everything. That afternoon, Lucas called to tell me he'd heard through Carrie's attorney that the relationship with her affair partner had ended. Apparently, the guy wasn't interested in dealing with her financial mess and legal drama. Lucas said Carrie was suddenly facing consequences without her backup plan and might be more motivated to settle now. I felt detached from the whole drama, like I was hearing about someone else's life instead of my own. Her choices and their fallout weren't my problem anymore, and I didn't feel satisfaction or sympathy, just blank distance. Brianna scheduled another mediation session 2 weeks out and sent both lawyers a formal agenda requesting good faith negotiations. The morning of the session, I sat in the same conference room with Lucas, while Carrie and her lawyer sat across the table. Brianna opened by acknowledging we'd made some progress and asked Carrie's side to respond to my settlement proposal. Her lawyer indicated she was willing to settle in principle, but wanted a larger lump sum, $10,000 instead of $5,000, claiming Carrie needed more support to get back on her feet. I countered through Lucas that I could do $7,000 if we immediately closed all shared bank accounts and split the proceeds from selling our furniture and household items. The negotiation felt transactional rather than emotional, like we were haggling over a used car instead of ending a marriage. Carrie stayed mostly quiet, while the lawyers went back and forth about specific dollar amounts and timelines. By the end of the session, we'd agreed to the $7,000 lump sum, 6 months of support, and mutual no-contact provisions. Brianna said she'd draft formal settlement language for review, and we could schedule a court date if both sides signed. The draft settlement agreement arrived by email 3 days later, a dense legal document that translated our negotiations into formal contract language. I read through it twice with Lucas on a video call, making sure every clause matched what we'd agreed to. The court date got set for 6 weeks out, giving both sides time to review and sign if we wanted to proceed. I felt tentative relief looking at that date on my calendar, not happiness exactly, but the possibility that this nightmare might actually end. Lucas warned me not to celebrate until the ink was dry and the judge approved everything, reminding me that Carrie could still back out or create problems. I told him I understood, but allowed myself a small moment of hope anyway. That same week, my program deadlines all clustered together in a perfect storm of stress. I was juggling portfolio submissions that required reflective essays and lesson artifacts, lesson plan revisions based on mentor feedback, final classroom observations where everything had to go perfectly, and legal paperwork that needed careful review. I survived by making detailed lists and setting timers for 15-minute work chunks, forcing myself to focus on one task at a time instead of spinning out about everything at once. I'd work on my teaching portfolio for 15 minutes, then review a section of the settlement agreement, then revise a lesson plan, then respond to Lucas about a legal question. The overwhelm was real, and some nights I barely slept, but I was managing it without falling apart or missing deadlines. A letter arrived in my mailbox from Carrie's parents, handwritten on fancy stationery that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. I opened it standing in my apartment hallway and read through their message that was half apology and half blame. They wrote that they were sorry I felt used and they'd always appreciated my help, but I should have communicated better about my concerns instead of just leaving. They said families work through problems together, and I'd given up too easily on their daughter. The letter made my jaw clench, but I chose not to respond, just folded it carefully and added it to my file of divorce documents in case it was needed later. I was learning that not every accusation deserved a defense, and some people would never see their own part in what happened. Lucas called me on a Thursday afternoon sounding frustrated and told me Carrie's lawyer had tried to slip a new clause into the settlement agreement. The clause claimed a percentage of any future earnings increases, basically saying if I got raises or promotions as a teacher, Carrie would get a cut. I refused immediately even though Lucas warned it might blow up the whole deal. I told him my future income was completely off limits, and if that was a deal breaker, then we'd go to trial. Lucas backed me up and sent a firm message to Carrie's lawyer saying the clause was unacceptable and needed to be removed for us to proceed. We waited 3 tense days where I barely slept, checking my email constantly and wondering if I'd just torpedoed the settlement over principle. Finally, Carrie's lawyer responded agreeing to remove the clause, probably because they knew a judge wouldn't approve it anyway. The judge scheduled a status conference to check on settlement progress, and both sides had to appear by video call. I sat at my laptop in my apartment while Lucas joined from his office, and Carrie appeared from somewhere with bad lighting. The judge asked Brianna to report on mediation progress, and she explained we were very close to final agreement with just minor language clarifications remaining. He looked directly at the camera and warned both sides about the cost and uncertainty of going to trial, his tone making it clear he thought we should settle this and stop wasting court resources. He said trials were expensive, unpredictable, and emotionally draining for everyone involved. I felt motivated by pragmatism rather than principle at that point, just wanting the whole thing done so I could focus on finishing my teaching program and starting my actual job. The judge set another status date 4 weeks out and told us he expected to see a signed settlement agreement by then. That weekend, I listed our shared couch, dining table, and bedroom set on 3 different marketplace apps, pricing everything to sell fast. Buyers started messaging within hours, and I spent Saturday coordinating pickups, watching strangers carry furniture down the stairs while I handed them cash. By Sunday evening, the apartment looked bare except for my air mattress, a folding chair, and boxes of kitchen supplies. I canceled our joint car insurance policy, closed 2 shared credit cards, and updated my mailing address at the bank. That night, I sat on the air mattress in the empty living room, feeling the loneliness settle around me like a physical weight. I let myself feel it without reaching for my phone or turning on the TV, just sitting there acknowledging that this was hard and real and necessary. The next morning, I caught Anne during her office hours and asked if we could talk somewhere private. We walked to the empty staff lounge, and I told her straight out that I was interested in her once the divorce was final, but I needed to finish this chapter first. She nodded slowly and said she wasn't going anywhere, that she respected the boundary and would rather wait and do things right than rush into something complicated. Her integrity made me even more certain she was worth waiting for, and we shook hands like we'd just made a business deal before heading back to our separate work. 2 days later, my students delivered their final project showcases, standing at the front of the classroom teaching each other about local history, with poster boards and handouts they'd designed themselves. 3 kids who'd started the semester completely checked out were now explaining historical events with genuine enthusiasm, answering questions from their classmates, and looking proud of their work. I stood in the back watching them teach each other and realized I was witnessing actual learning, not just kids memorizing facts for a test. The quiet joy I felt had nothing to do with anyone's approval or validation, just the simple satisfaction of seeing education work the way it should. The settlement hearing happened on a Thursday morning, and I put on my one decent suit, driving to the courthouse with my stomach tight. The judge reviewed our agreement out loud, noting the modest lump sum of $7,000, 6 months of spousal support at $500 monthly, mutual no-contact provisions, and no liability for family debts. He looked at me and asked if I understood and agreed to these terms. I said yes. He looked at Carrie and asked her the same question. She said yes. He signed the order and told us we were done, the whole thing taking maybe 15 minutes. I walked out of the courthouse feeling relief braided with loss, like I'd won something and lost something at the same time. That night, a wave of grief hit me hard and unexpected, not for Carrie specifically, but for the marriage I thought I had, the partnership I imagined, the future I'd planned. I sat on my air mattress crying for 20 minutes before pulling out my phone and booking an emergency therapy session for the next day. I let myself cry without trying to logic my way out of it or tell myself I should be over this already. Processing the grief felt healthier than suppressing it, even though it hurt worse in the moment. The next morning, I opened new bank accounts at a different institution, set up credit monitoring through one of those free services, and created a detailed filing system for all the divorce documents in case I ever needed them. The administrative tasks felt grounding, like I was protecting myself competently and carefully. My financial life was modest, but finally completely my own. No shared accounts or joint obligations tying me to someone who didn't love me. I sat down that afternoon and wrote a formal resignation email to my corporate job, keeping it professional and brief. My old boss called within an hour, ranting about unprofessionalism and burning bridges and how I'd never work in the industry again. I stayed calm, thanked him for the opportunity, and ended the call without engaging in the argument he clearly wanted. Walking away from that toxic environment without drama felt like its own kind of victory, proof that I could handle conflict without losing control. 3 days later, I completed my teaching credential program, and Gabrielle called me into her office for a final meeting. She offered sincere congratulations and told me the program was proud of how I'd navigated an incredibly difficult year while maintaining professionalism and growth. Her measured praise meant more than wild compliments because it was specific and earned, focused on actual things I'd accomplished, rather than vague encouragement. That weekend, Anne organized a small celebration at a cheap ramen place near campus, inviting a few colleagues from the program. We toasted to new beginnings with dollar beers, the warmth feeling communal rather than romantic, just people who respected each other sharing a meal. I felt content in a way that didn't require anything dramatic or intense, just the quiet satisfaction of being around good people. The following Monday, I completed new hire paperwork for my teaching job, filling out direct deposit forms and benefits enrollment, while the HR person explained sick leave policies and retirement contributions. She handed me classroom keys and a building map, pointing out where the supply closet and staff bathroom were located. I felt a surge of grounded confidence holding those keys, knowing the salary was tight, but workable, and the benefits were decent, and the work actually mattered to me. The following Monday, I arrived at my classroom 2 hours early, carrying boxes of supplies I'd bought with my limited budget. I started arranging the desks into small groups instead of rows, thinking about how I wanted kids to discuss ideas with each other instead of just listening to me talk. I hung posters on the walls, showing different learning strategies, and pinned up a sign that said, "Questions are more important than answers," above the whiteboard. I spent an hour organizing markers, notebooks, and handouts into labeled bins so students could grab what they needed without asking permission for every little thing. I printed out my year-long curriculum plan and taped it to my desk, scanning through the units I'd designed around student engagement instead of just test prep. The nerves hit me hard when I looked at the empty chairs and realized that actual kids would be sitting there in a few hours, counting on me to teach them something useful. But I took a breath and reminded myself that I'd prepared for this, that I'd chosen this work on purpose, and that being nervous just meant I cared about doing it right. I checked my email before the first bell and saw a message from Carrie's lawyer with the subject line, "Final Settlement Confirmation." I opened it and read 3 sentences confirming that Carrie had received the last payment, that her attorney considered all obligations fulfilled, and that the case was officially closed. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what she'd done, just a business-like statement that the legal matter was finished. I archived the email into a folder labeled "Divorce Complete" and felt something shift inside me, not anger or satisfaction, but just acceptance that she was who she was, and I didn't need her to change or apologize for me to move forward. I stood up and walked around my classroom one more time before students arrived, looking at the bulletin board I'd covered with quotes about curiosity and asking good questions and learning from mistakes. My apartment was small with cheap furniture, and I ate pasta most nights to stay within my tight budget. My marriage had failed, and I was still paying off the consequences of trusting the wrong person for 5 years. But I was teaching. I had a stable job with benefits, and I was building something that actually mattered to me, instead of just making money for someone else. The first day with students went better than I expected, with kids asking questions and actually engaging with the material, instead of just sitting there bored. After school, I was cleaning up when Anne knocked on my doorframe holding 2 cups of coffee from the teacher's lounge. She handed me one, and we talked about lesson plans, and which students seemed to need extra support, and how to handle the kid who kept disrupting every activity. She mentioned a strategy she'd used with a similar student last year, and I wrote it down, grateful for advice from someone who actually knew what they were doing. We kept things professional but warm, talking about work stuff without crossing into personal territory. Then she said, "So I'm free this weekend if you want to finally grab dinner somewhere nicer than the ramen place we always end up at." I felt something open up in my chest, a readiness to start something new without rushing or forcing it. I said yes, that I'd like that, and she smiled before heading back to her office. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open to my budget spreadsheet, updating the numbers to reflect my first paycheck. I noted that the spousal support payments would end in 5 months, and that my salary covered my rent, utilities, food, and student loan payments with about $200 left over each month for emergencies. I wasn't wealthy, and I hadn't gotten revenge on Carrie, and I wasn't perfectly healed from everything that had happened. But I was free from a relationship that had drained me for years. I had purpose in work that actually meant something. I felt cautiously hopeful about what came next, not in some dramatic way, but just in the quiet knowledge that I was standing steady in a life I'd actually chosen instead of one someone else had designed for me. And that's today's lesson tucked into a story. I try to make every one of these worth your time with something practical to take away. If it made you think or helped even a little, that's a win. Subscribe so you'll catch the next one.